As you're able, I want to ask you to remain standing for the reading of God's Word. This morning, we are going to be in Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. That can be found on page 10 of the blue Bibles under your seat, and it's also going to be on the screen behind me. Here is what the Word of the Lord says. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose, and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And so they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went, both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered up the burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." This is the word of the Lord.
Hey, good morning. Good to see you. Welcome to Cross and Crown. Great to have you with us today. In our time together over the last month or a month and a half or so, we've read a quote to you that is going to sound familiar. I'm going to say it again, and it comes from A.W. Tozer. And A.W. Tozer, probably his most well-known quote, Trey did it last week, is this: "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us." Now, again, you've heard us read that quote a few times in this series. We keep coming back to it because in a lot of ways, it captures the heart behind the series that we're in right now at our church. And the reason that we keep coming back to it as well, though, is that our lives run on whatever image of God we carry in our hearts. If the image of God that we have is distorted, like if it's not right, if it's wrong, actually, it affects other things. It affects things like our worship. It affects things like our obedience. It affects things like our hope in God. In fact, if we were to be really honest, many times on the street level theology for us, like our functional theology, how we think about God that way really shapes everything about us. And one of the most common ways, even some Christians think about God wrongly, is maybe you've heard this before, but it's what's known as the clockmaker God. And in this scenario, God builds the universe, he winds it up, and then he steps back and lets it run on its own. Now, that means this: God is not personally sustaining the universe. He's not intervening at all in the universe. He's kind of like a retired engineer who builds something very beautiful, but then steps back and is completely and utterly uninvolved in what he created. Now, again, I think for many people, again, even Christians, this way of thinking about God comes from somewhere. One of the places I think it can come from is a sense of disappointment or maybe even discouragement about life and the hardships and the suffering that we walk through. God, in those moments, seems distant. He seems detached from us. And so, because we don't feel God in those moments, we assume that He is a distant observer. We assume that He's not a participant in this world, and even more so in our lives. But if we go back to Tozer's quote, Tozer says that if that is the way that we think of God, then that will shape our life. And I will say that it would shape our life in the negative. It shapes our lives in ways in which God becomes distorted in our lives. And maybe I could just say it really plainly, that is not the God of the Bible. Thomas Watson once said, God is not like a builder that builds a house and then leaves it. He's like a pilot who steers the ship of the whole creation. Now, we're going to spend our time this morning looking together at this idea of what Watson is saying here. And what Watson is saying here is right. But let me ask you just a few questions here to get us thinking about this idea a little bit more. I wonder if you ever feel like God is truly present in your life. Like, is God really present in the everyday details of your life? Or maybe you feel like God is that distant observer. He's somehow disconnected from your life. He's detached from your life. Maybe you felt this like when something happens to you and it feels random, it feels unfair, maybe it feels unexplainable. You think like, why do I feel that way, especially as a believer, when I know that God is present with me? How do you explain moments when everything seems to fall apart? How do you explain what's going on in your life despite your best efforts when things just seem to be unraveling? And maybe the real question is this: how would our decisions and our prayers, our perspective change if we believe that God was actually involved in every moment of our lives? And not only our lives individually, but involved in the universe, every moment of it. We're almost halfway through a series that we began at the end of June called Most High, where we're looking at what are called the attributes of God. And the first part of this series has been really spending time talking about attributes that God alone has. Theologians call this the incommunicable attributes of God, which is a fancy word to say these are things that God in His own being has that He does not share with us. And the latter half of this series will be looking at the attributes of God that we do share in some way with Him. But today we're still kind of in that realm of incommunicable attributes. The attributes of God are the qualities that reveal who God truly is. It's the characteristics of who God is in His very being. And we're looking at these attributes because of what Tozer said. Understanding God rightly is the most important thing about you. So if we can get these attributes straight in our hearts and our souls, I believe that it will actually contribute to so much good in our lives. And as we continue our series this morning on another attribute of God, I want to invite you to see three things. First, God's providence gives strength. God's providence gives strength. Second, God's providence gives rest. And then lastly, God's providence gives security. So God's providence gives strength, it gives rest and security. So if you have your Bibles or electronic devices, keep them open to Genesis chapter 22, beginning there in verse 1. Kiddos, on your sermon sheets, the book of the Bible there that you need to write in is Genesis. The chapter is 22. And Whether you're an adult or a kid, you've been in the church, you've probably heard the story that you heard Trey read from Genesis 22 before. It's one of the most well-known stories in all of the Bible. It is a story that is about the testing of Abraham. It's God testing Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. And on the surface, if we're talking about an attribute of God, it might make sense to talk about this morning God's trustworthiness. And in some ways, that is woven into what we are going to talk about. And the story is for sure no less than this idea that God is the one who can be fully relied upon. But there is something actually deeper happening in this story, and it touches on the attribute that we're going to look at today. So look with me, if you would, beginning in verse 1. I'm not going to read all of the verses again, but let me just kind of walk us through what's happening here in this story. The very beginning verse of this chapter is really a summary of what's getting ready to happen. It's a statement that we're going to see here in our story today, that God is going to test Abraham. Now, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, that word test is translated to mean to be proven by trial. It's the language of the furnace, right? It's the language of metal being refined. And spiritually speaking, what we're talking about here is that the faith that a person has will be revealed in this process of refinement. Now, God doesn't test people, his people, because he needs to prove something to himself, right? This is not because God is somehow insecure and he needs to test his people to see whether or not they love him or, want to follow him or not. He knows everything. He doesn't need that kind of reassurance. The point of God testing his children is to prove that their faith is real. It's to test their faith in such a way that it develops perseverance. It's to help lead his children to maturity. And so, when we see tests in the Bible, they are not these sort of pointless things in the hands of God. He's somehow needing to be reassured about whether or not people like him. They are actually purposeful things designed for that person's good and ultimately for his glory. And you know this in particularly in the New Testament, we learn that it is our benefit, actually, it's to our benefit to undergo trials, because whatever the source of that testing is, God is doing something in us to grow us. Now, the story of Abraham and Isaac puts that principle to the test, in my opinion. And here's what I mean by that. If you look there at verse 2, we immediately see what the test is that God gives Abraham. If you're a parent this morning, this should shake you a bit. Here's what God says to Abraham. He says, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a sacrifice to me." Now again, if you're a parent here this morning, put yourself in Abraham's shoes. This request would likely be completely baffling to you, right? Everything in you would scream against it. The very instinct of parenthood is to protect your child, not to sacrifice them. And notice how God stacks the nouns to show the cost, right? God knows that Isaac is the joy of Abraham's heart. It's his only son. He's saying, like, I know that your son is the visible guarantee of my word to you. But still yet, God asks for his son. And Abraham's response to God here is stunning to me. It's not what I would have expected. He doesn't argue with God. He doesn't try to stall with God. What we begin to see is the hard work of obedience that comes from the command of God, right? He saddles the donkey, he cuts the wood, he gathers his servants that next morning. And don't miss, those are not throwaway details. Don't miss this. They are meant to show us a faith that moves forward step by step, even when the heart is probably breaking, right? And in verse 4 it says, as they make their way to the place where the sacrifice was going to happen, it says that Abraham saw the place, all right? Now, in my spiritual imagination, I just have to think that walking toward the mountain without seeing the spot where God was calling him to sacrifice his son is one thing. But then to actually in view see the place where God was calling his son to die, it really moves from just sort of a theory to an actual terrifying reality. I mean, again, imagine the emotions that Abraham would have had, that lump in his throat when he saw that spot, the weight in his chest. The sight of the mountain had to transform the test from this sort of distant command now into a real agony. But in spite of what would have been an overwhelming anguish for him, look there at verse 5. Abraham tells the servants to wait, and he says he and Isaac are going to go and worship and then return. Now don't miss this either. Notice that Abraham calls what they're getting ready to do as worship. In other words, what God has called Abraham to do, what he's commanded Abraham to do, to sacrifice his son, Abraham is calling worship. In other words, even in the face of a command that was tearing probably at the very fabric of his heart, Abraham frames obedience here not as sadness, but as devotion. And that really is, by the way, what worship is. Worship is about yielding everything. It's what you heard Zach say earlier, everything to God. It's your dearest treasure. Everything that you have that is in you, you give it back to the God who gave it to you in the first place. Worship is about trusting God, even when God's commands and promises appear to collide in our lives. So in verse 6, you see the father and the son walking together toward the hill. Isaac's carrying the wood for his own sacrifice here. Abraham is carrying the fire that will light the wood to sacrifice his son, and the knife for Isaac's ultimate death. And it's at this moment that Isaac notices something, right? You notice the question he asks? There isn't an animal to sacrifice. Isaac doesn't know at this point that he is the sacrifice. Here's what it says. It says, he says to his father that, like, where is the sacrifice? And this is what Abraham says to him. He says, God, in verse 8, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. Even in that moment, Abraham is trusting something about God here that will sustain and uphold him in the test. Now, I want to point your attention to a word there in verse 8 that really does start to move us toward today's attribute of God. And it's the word provide. Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. And we heard in this story that God, or we know in this story that God does that very thing, right? He spares Isaac. He provides a ram for sacrifice. We're not going to read all of that part of our story again, but what I want you to see here in this word, the word provide, it's actually a word in the Hebrew that means to see. To see. In other words, Abraham is literally saying to Isaac here, God will see for himself a lamb. Or we could say it this way, God will see to it that a sacrifice is provided. You guys know that phrase, right? To see to something means to take care of it or to attend to it, right? It implies responsibility. It implies action to ensure that something is actually done. Now, when someone says that, what it means is that they are going to make sure that something is done, right? And if you hear somebody say, hey, I'll see to it that report gets finished on time, it means that person is going to make sure that report is completed. It communicates attention. It communicates responsibility. It communicates oversight. And that is exactly why Moses wrote it this way in Genesis. He's pointing us to this reality. He is saying God in this moment is not merely observing what's going on. He is actively involved in fulfilling his own promises and securing what is needed for his people. In the Old King James Version, Abraham names this place, you see this at the very end of this passage where God supplied the sacrifice, Jehovah Jireh, which translates literally to God provides. God is the provider. And then you notice that there is also this longer explanation of the name there. It says, on the mount of the Lord where God provides. In the old KJV, it actually says, on the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. And here we are back to this idea of provision, God seeing to his will being known. And the connection, I think, is unmistakable. Let me try to help bring this together here. God always sees to what must be done. God always sees to what must be done. In our story, the mountain really represents what is true about God. God is always at work. He's ensuring that his purposes are accomplished and that his promises are fulfilled. And that brings us to today's attribute. What we really see here, undergirding the story of Abraham and Isaac, is what is known as, listen, the providence of God. Kiddos, on your sermon sheet, that word is probably there. You're going to hear that a little bit more as we move forward. You can make marks for that. But the idea of the providence of God is what I want us to look at this morning. And as Moses wrote here in Genesis 22, God's personal engagement with Abraham was so obvious that Moses could refer to God's perfect seeing as implying God's purposeful doing. Are you with me? All right? So God's seeing here was his seeing to something. His perception implies provision, or we could say his providence. Those both provision and providence have the same root word, right? But before I explain that a little bit more, I think I want to say this, because many times when we start talking about the providence of God, we wonder, are we just using a synonym for the sovereignty of God? And though they're very closely related, I don't think they're exactly the same thing. And this morning I want to focus on the providence of God. So I do think it's important to kind of help make this distinction here. Providence includes the idea of sovereignty. God's sovereignty focuses, you know this, on God's right and power to do what he wants and what he wills. But God's sovereignty does not focus on God's purposes necessarily in what he does. That's what God's providence does. God's providence focuses on the purposeful design of God's governing of everything. John Piper says it this way. He kind of brings them together, and he says it this way. Providence is God's wise and purposeful sovereignty. Now, here's how our confession, the 1689, says it at a very high level in chapter 5 on this idea of divine providence. Just hang with me on this. It says it this way. God, the good creator of all things, in his infinite power and wisdom, does uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures and things, from the greatest even to the least, by his most wise and holy providence, to the end for the which they were created, according unto his infallible foreknowledge and the free and immutable counsel of his own will, to the praise of the glory of his wisdom, power, justice, infinite goodness, and mercy. Now, that is a mouthful. There's a lot there. In fact, you heard the word immutable in there. That was an attribute we looked at a few weeks ago as well. But I think what we find here in this definition in the 1689 really does help us get a grasp of what God's providence is and how what it does, how God enacts his providence. And there's really three things that I want us to look at here as we think about that. The first is what is known as God's preservation in his providence. And here's what I mean by that. God is continually involved in all creation and with all created things in such a way that he keeps them preserved. Or we could say he keeps them maintained. And he keeps them preserved and maintained for the purposes for which he created them. That's the first idea, preservation. Now, second, through God's providence, we also have what is known as God's harmony, or his harmonization of all things. And here's what that means. God is continually involved with all created things in such a way that he's able to keep all created things and their actions in harmony with his good and perfect and pleasing will. Now this is a deep idea. We're going to get into this a little bit more here in just a moment. But how you would probably think, how can that be true? How does God harmonize our free, responsible actions with his ultimate decrees in the world? But that is the second part of God's providence. And then third, through God's providence, we have what I would call God's governance. And this is a close cousin to preservation, but it's a little different. We aren't talking, by the way, about human governments or political orders here. What this means is that God is continually involved with all created things in such a way that he directs them to his ultimate purpose, to his aim, to his end. Now that's a lot to consider. So let's slow down just a moment and briefly unpack these ideas just a little bit more, just to help us get our heads wrapped around it. So let's go first back to the idea of God's preservation in providence. Colossians 1:17 reminds us that in him all things hold together, which means that the reason that atoms don't unravel into nothingness is because God refuses to let it be so. He gives the oceans their boundaries. He gives the planets their orbits. He keeps the stars burning, all the way down to keeping cells dividing. In fact, preservation and providence is often tied to worship in the Bible. Psalm 148 calls on the sun and the moon and the mountains and even the beasts to praise the name of the Lord, because their very existence is a song of sustained dependence. Like the heavens and the earth are preserved not merely for their own sake. They're preserved to give glory to their Maker, and thus that's the connection to worship. But also, when Peter speaks of the heavens and the earth being kept until the day of judgment, what Peter is saying is that there is both a mercy and a warning to this idea of God's preservation in his providence. Here's what I mean. Every heartbeat is an undeserved reprieve to give us space for repentance. And particularly for those that are unbelievers, those who are living apart from God, that is like proof of divine patience, that God is even preserving their life. Like even the wicked live and breathe because the God they deny is preserving them. He's given them one more chance to repent. So preservation and providence is really a grace. It's a grace that is extended to a rebellious world. It's extended to even rebellious believers. And for the believer, every breath that we have is sustained by Christ as an opportunity to use that breath to praise him, to move towards him, just like creation that we just said, because he's preserving us. So God's preservation and providence is such an important thing for us to remember. But how often do we deny that truth in our life? We act as if God's preservation in his providence is optional. And the way that we do that functionally is we think we can control our own lives, or better, preserve them ourselves. We take our lives into our own hands in all kinds of ways because we don't think that God is really in control and can hold us, sustain us, preserve us. Jeremiah 17:5 reminds us that cursed is the man who makes flesh his strength, makes his or her flesh his strength. See, to place confidence only in our flesh, this is what Jeremiah says, is to invite futility into our lives. To attempt to preserve ourselves through our own strength is at the bottom an accusation against God. We just said that God is the one who holds all things together. So that means we aren't the ones that should be trying to hold ourselves together, not in our own strength. But do you see that when we believe that idea that somehow we can preserve ourselves control our own lives in such a way that we're safe, we're secure, we're disconnecting ourselves from the very source who can perfectly preserve us. See, every time that you insist on safeguarding your life in some way apart from God, you are saying in essence that you believe that God's power is not sufficient, that His wisdom is not something that can sustain you. And to live that way is to live in opposition to the very truth that we just proclaimed. But there is a better way. And that brings me to the first thing I want you to see this morning. God's providence gives strength. Real strength. Like, to trust in God's preserving providence is to trust in the hands that hold the universe. And so this has been my prayer a lot lately. Lord, help me surrender my plans, my efforts, my anxieties to the one whose providence preserves me. And I'm trusting this, and I'm praying this for you too, that when we stop holding on to what we cannot keep, we will discover that life that God has for us is the one that He is truly preserving for us. And as we do that, He gives us strength. Strength from His hands. Requires trust on our part, for sure. But I pray that we can be connected to the very source who can preserve us through His providence. Now, second, we said that in God's providence, He somehow harmonizes His good and perfect pleasing will, His decrees, what He ordains, with us in our everyday lives, in our actions. It's a mystery to me. I don't quite understand all of it, but I trust what God says about it in His Word. Because this is what His Word says. Every moment of history is a joint venture between God's eternal decree and our real actions, and there aren't any contradictions between those two things. There is no event in our lives, there is no event in the world that is so mundane or big and wide-ranging that God Himself is not the hidden author and ordainer. God feeds the birds. We just sang that in The Lord Will Provide, right? He feeds the sparrows. He governs, though, the migration of the stars. He determines the rise and the fall of nations. And somehow, all that being true, He is equally involved in the steps of men. And this is true, again, whether the events are pleasant or whether they're painful. Whether those things are ordinary things or miraculous things. Nothing is left outside of the scope of God's hand. And somehow God harmonizes in His providence our own steps, our own lives. Acts 17 says it this way: in Him we live and move and have our being. Paul is saying that our lives, in all of its changes and all of its movement, is somehow carried along by God's providence. And He's harmonizing His will and man's real actions all through that. I actually think the mystery deepens when we see that God harmonizes His will even through the evil actions of men. We see this in the story of Joseph. We've mentioned this before in this series, but Joseph's brothers meant to harm him. And in many ways they did. But in the end, Joseph could still say that what he went through, God meant for good, even though what he experienced was grave evil. And so, in a way here, understanding this idea of how God harmonizes His will with us in our lives, I think it actually begins to help make sense of life's pains and even its highest joys. Because God does not merely allow everything, He weaves them harmoniously into His plan with provision. Now, again, the inverse of this is what we tend to do. And what I mean by that is we tend to not see God doing it that way. We tend to deny God's harmony in His providence. And if you're like me, when I do that, what that leads to is not hopefulness, it's not joy, it's not a sense of freedom. It leads to despair. It leads to discouragement. And if we aren't careful, that is what we can experience over and over and over, because we don't believe that God is working all things together for the good of those who love Him. Honestly, what we're doing in that is the same script that the culture lives by. Our culture tries to cope with suffering and injustice by calling things random, by chalking things up to fate or just chaos. But friends, denying the way that God works out His will in the world, even through real humans, is so damaging to us. It leads to bitterness. It leads to helplessness. Why? Because life lived that way will always disappoint, because we can't control our lives. In fact, what we see in our culture is that denying God's providence in the world, it leads to rage. Like when injustices fester and there's no assurance of divine reckoning or redemption, there's no outlet or there's no trust in something to take care of that. And then that leads to cynicism. Because if history is not guided by God, then it's nothing but a cruel joke. And life then becomes, I think, for many, an adventure in distraction. Choosing one shallow pleasure after another just to keep from thinking too hard about the emptiness. And if we're not careful as believers, we can fall into the same trap. Distraction from what is real is not real life. Yes, it seems to maybe soothe the ache for a little bit, but it will never give you the ultimate answer, and it will leave you restless. If you ever wonder why you feel so anxious and restless, it's because of, this is what Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in God. It's the only place where we can find a sense of rest. And by that, what Augustine means is that our hearts by default are anxious. They are impatient. They are troubled until we rest in God. That brings me to the second thing that I want you to see this morning. God's providence also gives rest. Fate and like chaos, if that's what you think about your life and like what's happening in your life, it will leave you absolutely and utterly restless. But God's harmony in providence can make us very secure, because what the world calls chaos, faith calls providence. Providence gives rest. God's providence gives rest. Now, lastly, God's governance in providence is what I want to talk about. And again, this is God's purposeful direction in all things toward the ends that He has ordained. Again, similar to preservation, a little bit different, but let me get at it this way. In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, when it says that God upholds the universe, it really means more than just sustaining it, right? Which is what we said earlier with preservation. It actually means to bear along with it, like with deliberate directions. Think of it this way. It's like a ship that has a skilled captain at its helm moving towards its appointed harbor. God's governance, the way that He governs the world, is like that. It's the ongoing piloting of reality itself. And it's not only the physical stuff that we're thinking of here. I want you to think of it even more broadly. It's teleological. God's governance is aimed at something. Now, that aiming is found in a place like Psalm 103, where it says, His kingdom rules over all. Ephesians 1 says it this way: He accomplishes all things according to the counsel of His will. Now, it would be tempting to see those things being said, God saying that about Himself, in a fatalistic way, And what I mean by that is we go, well, I guess things are just the way that they are. It is what it is. God's going to do what He's going to do. That is what it is. But that's not what providence or God's governance and providence means. God's governance and providence means it's what God wills. And we said this earlier, that means that there is purpose in God's providence. It's not fatalistic. It's actually purposeful. And because what God wills is good and right, we can rest, you and I, not in a kind of cold fatalism or necessity, but in this warm certainty that all things are being bent towards Christ's glory and our good. Even when we look at events in history that we are walking through right now, those events are God's servants that are advancing His kingdom toward the day when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. So when we talk about God's governance in His providence, we can be assured that history is a straight line pointed at the throne of Christ. Like, we can know that, even in the midst of what feels like chaos. And this means that there is no suffering in your life that is wasted, ever. There is no injustice that will be ignored ultimately. There is no enemy that will be unjudged ultimately. The end is certain. The aim is settled. And that certainty makes us bold in the here and now because we know how the story ends. But we are quick to deny this truth as well. We don't believe that God is a skilled captain leading us and our world to its appointed harbor. Instead, we seek independence from that. We seek independence from a God who is working all things out for the good, and we try to captain our own ship. We replace His rule with other governors. See, our age idolizes governance by man. And this happens in a lot of places. Sometimes it's through the state, sometimes it's through science, through education, through social progress, whatever it may be. Those things are a final authority to so many people. But in that worldview, everything is relative. Who gets to decide what is true, what isn't true? Because everybody's getting to decide for themselves what ultimately is wise. What's happening in that is man is elevating their own wisdom over God's. And that path leads to frustration. That path leads to contradiction because man cannot order the universe in the same way that God does. God sustains things in our universe, and He has an aim for those things. And to try to figure those things out apart from Him leads to, this is similar to what we said earlier, to futility. Only in God do we have the moral order, for example, to make sense of the world. And not just the moral order, just to make sense of everything. And so, like, when we deny God's governance through His providence, we become our own governor. We become our own ruler. And I just need to say, like, that is a yoke that we were never intended to carry. It's only when we submit to the God who governs all things can we find true clarity about life. And not only this life, but the life to come. And that really brings me to the third thing I want you to see this morning. God's providence brings security. I don't know about you, but this has been an interesting season in my life. I generally feel pretty secure as a man and as a believer. But when you go through something really difficult, it shakes you. And one of the ways that you could describe that is it makes you feel insecure. You feel less secure than you did. And for me, it's been like, I've asked myself, like, I've wondered about, like, who are you, Brad? Like, why do you feel this way? This is not normally how you feel. And a lot of what I would describe as the things that have contributed to that kind of feeling is the way in which we're talking this morning in the negative about how I don't really believe that God's in control. I don't believe that He is working His good and perfect and pleasing will out in my life, in the life of this church, and in the world. And if I don't believe that, I will not have the kind of security that He desires to give. And this idea that we're talking about right now of God's governance in Providence, that He is working out His ultimate will, and it is good, that is what I'm actually supposed to believe in. Because that is what we just said. That's what brings real security. Real, like, groundedness. When we yield to a God who is directing our lives and the world to His ends, we can have a certainty that our efforts align with a wisdom far beyond our own. Guys, I need that. You need that. And so, submitting to God and what He's doing in His providence, this is also, I think, important. It doesn't nullify responsibility. It doesn't mean that we just sort of say, Jesus, take the wheel. It means that as we move into and understand what His will is, He is giving us opportunities to work with Him in that, and He's ordering that responsibility to His ends. Our labor is joined, listen, to a cosmic order. It's joined to the God of the universe. And that cosmic order that God gives, it's nothing we could ever create or conjure up. That means every pursuit that you and I walk in, and particularly as I think about this in the early days of this new work here at Cross and Crown, every pursuit is held within the hands of the one who sustains everything. We are not left adrift here. We are not left to our own devices to pull up our bootstraps to try to be strong and do this work. No, we are empowered to do the work, to act faithfully, knowing that our smallest acts of obedience are participating in the fulfillment of what we're talking about here, God's good and perfect plan. So, as we close this morning, I want to read a quote to you. This is also from Thomas Watson as well. And in a lot of ways, what Watson does here is he turns on its head where we started. We said at the very beginning of our time that many times the way that we view God is as a distant observer, as a clockmaker God. He makes the clock, He starts to let it run, he gets it going, and then He steps away. But we've seen this morning that that's not the God of the Bible. God is not a distant observer. He doesn't step back from His creation. He actually moves towards it. But listen to what Thomas Watson says here. He says, God is the great superintendent of the world. He holds the golden reins of government, and that's not, again, a political order He's talking about. He's talking about His governance in His hand, guiding all things most regularly and harmoniously to their proper end. Providence is the queen and governess of the world. It is the hand which turns the wheel of the whole creation. It sets the sun its race, the sea its bounds. If God did not guide the world, things would run into disorder and confusion. And listen to this. He says, when one looks on a clock and sees the motion of the wheels, the striking of the hammer, he would conclude that some artificer made it. Just so, when we see the excellent order and harmony in the universe, the sun, that great luminary dispensing its light and heat to the world, without which the world were but a grave or a prison, the rivers sending forth their silver streams to refresh the bodies of men and prevent a drought, and every creature acting within its sphere and keeping its due bounds, listen, we must need acknowledge there is a God who wisely orders and governs all things. Friends, that is good news. I pray that we would get that into our hearts so deeply. It's what brings peace. It's what brings security. It's what brings clarity to our lives. I pray that we would trust in a God who we know wisely orders and governs all things. Let's pray together. Heavenly